Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 47. We're almost 50.
Oh my gosh.
Of Genn and Millie. Can we do a 50th birthday party?
Absolutely. Let's
and
do it.
I believe there should be cake.
Okay. Yeah, I'm down.
White cake. White wedding cake is the ultimate. I mean, I don't like to say vanilla because it's not really vanilla.
I love the taste of vanilla.
But I feel like white wedding cake isn't really vanilla-y. It just feels like white wedding cake. Anyway, okay. I love it. Okay. It's my favorite dessert. Episode 47, close to 50, of Genn and Millie, where a Gen Xer and millennial share this strength-based perspective through which they view the world. We are your hosts, Allison and Tess.
Yeah. Hey.
Yep.
Yeah. Yup.
Welcome to Stressville.
Welcome to a bunch of people who are very sleep deprived and very stressed, but that's where we're at right now. We are less than a week out from conference, so we are recording this the Wednesday before conference is Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday of next week. So I think we are both, in a place of, oh my goodness, it's happening, and
chaos.
Now it's just a little bit of all the details. I like to call it and you didn't get my reference because you don't watch Friends, but I called it chaotic and twirly earlier, which is a Phoebe Buffay reference.
So I would call it I think you made reference to sandpaper.
Uh-huh.
We get sandpapery.
Yep.
I'm approaching rough sandpaper.
Yes.
And I keep thinking, when all this is said and done, it'll be good. It'll be good. There are a lot of great things happening. I think you and I are super stoked about Mr. Geringer. Say it with me.
Mike Geringer.
Mm-hmm. Mike Geringer.
Oh my gosh.
Mike. Because I say Geringer.
Yeah, you do.
Mike Geringer.
Yes, Jur.
As
in a jar, but Jur.
Like my friend Jeremy, who I used to call Jur, but now I call Jay. Okay.
Geringer.
Jur. So we are both super stoked about him being at our conference. He is literally the Tom Osborne of mentoring research.
Yep, he's
awesome.
He hosts his own podcast called Reflections on Research, which is great. You get to hear from mentoring researchers.
He's brilliant, and I've been reading his work for a long, long time. Mm-hmm. And then Tess and I got to have a dialogue with him, and we both, I thought, were very calm and seemed very professional.
Oh, yeah.
But I was a little bit of a...
I think the fangirl face is worn off for me. Like, he's great, and I'm just like, he's a human, right? And he just does really cool stuff. So I definitely, when I first met him, was like, oh my gosh, it's my character.
I think I love being around brilliant people.
Oh, yeah.
I just love being around thinkers.
So fun.
I love thinking.
Love thinking.
On that note, welcome to Think Time.
Welcome to Think Time. So this episode is going to be a little bit different. We queued it up at the end of episode 46 that we were going to do an episode on strengths in the Enneagram. And we want to key this up a little bit because we are Genn and Millie, the strengths-based perspective through which we view the world. So we are probably coming into this definitely with a strengths-based perspective. Mm-hmm. But we have had questions about the Enneagram. What is it? How does it differ? As well as lots of people in our own lives, at least lots of people in my life that have asked about it, that love it, that, so we had talked for a while about doing kind of an episode on what is the Enneagram. But we do want to state for the record, we're strengths-based people. And you'll find, and I've done quite a bit of work to learn about the Enneagram. Gone to a day-long workshop with a current contemporary Enneagram expert, and as well as read, I think, 4 books on it and listened to podcasts and have done a lot of my own research. And just I'll get into a little bit of like the perceived history of it, but there's a lot of like Christian faith ties to the framework of the Enneagram. And so, I heard about it when I was at Creighton, being part of the Ignatian spirituality realm, kind of got typed there. So I've known about it for a while, but it just seemed to explode lately. So I think we wanted to a little bit of like engage in the dialogue, right? Like last episode was about the Face app because that had exploded, right? And so I feel like the Enneagram is everywhere now and everybody's talking about it. And I've had just a lot of people ask me like, how do you reconcile what the Enneagram says about personality, and how does that, with a strengths-based perspective?
And I think you tasking me to take this, which very rarely do you ask me to do something. And I think on the last podcast you said you've never told someone they need to do.
I have never told, but I thought for the sake of Genn and Millie, I feel like we needed to know your type so we could engage in this dialogue more. So, and I will talk a little bit about that. Like, I would never ask somebody to type themselves in the Enneagram because it's very, very different. I ask everybody what their top 5 are. Like, everybody if they never got strengths, right? Because that's just wonderful.
It's like, are you right-handed or left-handed?
Right, yeah. It's like, are you blonde or brunette? You know, like the fun things about us, right, that we can very clearly see. The Enneagram is a lot more internal work, and it's a lot more personal and very vulnerable. And so it's never something that I would put on somebody else to do, except you are my one rare exception where for the sake of this, I thought it would be really helpful then only me speaking out of knowing my type and how that compares to my strengths, my Enneagram number, and how that compares to my strengths, to be able to kind of compare and contrast yours as well. And I'll talk a little bit about the way I asked you to do it versus the best practice for how one should do it based on what I've read.
And I really appreciated that you did. I may have pushed back a little bit.
Yeah.
But I very much appreciate that you tasked me to do it, because I probably wouldn't have.
Yeah.
In all honesty, I probably wouldn't have done it. I am a big time strengths believer.
Yeah.
So I've kind of settled into this is the assessment for me, and one that I want to advocate and be around. So I kind of step back from other instruments. And
absolutely.
Your knowledge and your expertise, but also I've witnessed your learner just thriving around this.
So this is where this is a very different contrast even of our strengths. Like, we can spot this, right? So your input might hear a little bit about it, or even how you got me that magnet that kind of looked like the Enneagram thing. Like, that's your input, like knowing a little bit about it, right? Gathering resources. If you hear something, you might send it along to me. Hey, I heard this about the Enneagram. So my learner, if I get curious about something, it gets to mastery, right?
Yes.
So I have spent over a year studying this, learning about it, learning about people around me who have invested in it. And finally, I feel like I come to a place where I can somewhat explain the framework. So I think I'm going to start with giving a general overview of what it is, how you understand it, and then I've written out kind of a compare-contrast list of the Enneagram versus strengths, like how it differs. And so
the fun part of this is that I'm learning brand new. I'm brand new to this.
Yep.
Right along with probably a lot of our listeners.
Yeah.
So I'm a traveler with you. I want to know, would you prefer I write down my questions that I have for you, or would you? Okay.
Chime in.
All right.
This is as if it's a conversation, right?
Okay.
Like, I'm explaining this to you, and you are kind of sitting in the role of anybody that might be listening to this episode right now. And any questions that pop into your head, like, okay, hey, wait, clarify that, or let's just engage in a dialogue around it. I have prepared probably more than I have for any other episode. I have actual notes and things that I wrote out in preparation, because I also know that I am not an Enneagram expert. I am a certified strengths coach. I know strengths a whole lot more, and have definitely invested probably more than most people in my Enneagram knowledge, but I would not at all claim myself as an expert or to know this fully to really be able to teach it, but I'm going to try. So essentially, the Enneagram is a 9-type personality structure that is really oriented around our core motivations as human beings. So essentially, of this 9-point structure, we each have one core type. So one that is our type that we claim, that is essentially our personality, who we are. It is rumored to be rooted in like ancient Christian spirituality. So there's a lot of people who like try and throw it all the way back to, like, I've heard people reference Aristotle and, St. Ignatius of Loyola, and like which Ignatius of Loyola is a little more contemporary, but a lot of like ancient thinkers and ancient theologians claiming that their 9 views, or their views on personality, was actually a premeditation of the Enneagram. There is no true evidence for that, and so my context says you can't make up history or try and do reflective history that redefines or puts a new narration on history. Right. So it really started coming around in the 60s and the 70s. Is really when it became big, when a lot of study of personality became big. So it's around that same time, and has really started to explode. I would just say, like, in the last year, it seems to be everybody's talking about it, going to workshops on it. So you have your core type, that is your number, and you can go about finding your number. There's everybody teaches it a little bit differently. How do you discover what your number is? I come from kind of a thought process, and a lot of the people I've read and that have taught have said that it is a process to finding your number, that there actually is not an assessment, a test, a quiz that will tell you your number. Now, you're going to say, what on earth, because you have me take a quiz to find my number. There is this one quiz that I gave Allie to find her number for the sake of time, because it's absolutely crazy right now, and I knew you didn't have the time, nor I had the time to really invest in finding your number in the best practice, quote unquote, way. But also, this recently came out, this assessment called IEQ-9, and it has a couple decades of research into identifying the motivation. So and it comes from Ian Cron, who is one of the big Enneagram leaders. And so essentially, he has published this, and it seems to have some sort of reputable, respected, and valid way of identifying your core type. I wouldn't encourage people to do this as their first way of doing it, right? Like, this is an easy, like, check off the box, but it's actually not the most authentic way, they say, of finding your type. The best way is to learn about all of them and find which one resonates with you. So reading through all of them, getting to know all 9 types, and then whichever one is the one you align with most based on your core motivation, right? And you only know your motivation. Something outside of you can't, will help you to identify yours. So that, and generally that's often done through meeting with someone that can help walk you through it. So they're often called typing sessions. So you'll meet with someone for a while, they'll get to know you. There are several Enneagram leaders, like Suzanne Stabile is a big one, along with Ian, that will do finding your number, finding your type workshops, and they're like 8 hours of essentially teaching on all 9 types, and then whichever one is the one that pulls at you, that you have the most guttural reaction to, that's your type. So there's, a few different ways, but essentially there's no one quiz, assessment, anything really that is valid enough to surely identify your type. So you have that core type, which takes a lot of people a while to identify. And I had gone through a typing session with someone when I was at Creighton during one of my kind of spirituality groups that I was a part of. We kind of all talked about it, and somebody that knew it a lot more than me, we went out for coffee, and she kind of talked through all the types, and it turns out when I got more into it that it was actually a mistype. So I was initially had a different type that I claimed and thought was mine, that it turns out my motivation is slightly different. And so and now that I've really dug into it, I know for sure that my type is my type. But there are a lot of mistypings that happen of people that think, even that have bias about what they want, who they want to be.
Right.
That might type themselves as something that they actually aren't.
Okay, so I'm going to ask my first question.
Yep.
You would have typed me differently than what these results are.
I think if we would have sat down in a session, and I would have gone through all of the steps in a typing session, I think we would have come to this conclusion of your type that this report came out with. I think on my initial reactions to your behavior, right? And so this is the core thing, that the Enneagram's about your motivation, why you do things. So I see your behavior and I can interpret or tell myself a narrative about what your behavior is, or what your motivation for that behavior is, but it might not be accurate, right? You and I can choose to do the exact same activity, but the reasons why we do that activity is going to be different because we have different core types.
So and the reason I asked that question is around is it better to do a type? You're saying it's better and more accurate to do a typing session, but yet I feel like this got to probably the core of me.
Yeah. So that's the thing, is there's a billion different Enneagram tests out there. This one is very new, and it seems to be, when I read a little bit about the development of this specific assessment I had you take, seems to have a fair amount of validity to it, that I trusted it enough to give it to you for the means of the ends of recording this episode, right? And so, yes, but traditionally the most respected and valid and authentic way that almost most Enneagram teachers that I have listened to or read from say that it's a typing session, or simply doing some in-depth study of all of the types to then find where you align most naturally.
Okay.
Yep. Okay. So you have your center type, and then within each type, so the 9 points kind of revolve around this spoke. And there are all these lines connecting the different numbers to each other. I'm trying to describe this in an audio way is not the best, but I might give a screenshot in our post. You can look at that if you want to. But essentially, each type has 2 lines, one line that moves away from it and one line that moves towards it. And those are called a few different things. So the Enneagram teacher that I learned from called them lines of integration and disintegration. But I think the easiest way to explain them as your lines of stress and security. So when you are in a place of stress, a negative place, almost to use strengths language, right? You drop into the basement. You naturally take on characteristics from a different number, usually the average or unhealthy characteristics of another number. And then the opposite is true when you're in security. So security or integration, kind of that move towards would be a place where you're not worried about things as much. You don't have as much fear, maybe as much anger or stress. You take on the average or healthy lines of characteristics of the line that you move towards in stress, right? Okay, so an example of mine, so my core type is an 8. So most naturally I am, there's lots of different terms for them, even each of the types, but the 8 is kind of the challenger, sometimes can be called the controller, kind of the justice seeker, so lots of different words for that. And in my integration, so when I am in a place of security, life is going 5, I actually move to a 2, which is your core type. So I take on the characteristics of you.
Consider it helpers too.
So I take on, I take on your characteristics when I am in a place from my type.
Okay, I'm already confused. All right, let's do a timeout. Okay, so mine is 2, not 1.
Yours is 2. You're 2. Yep.
I'm a 2, not a 1?
You're 2.
I thought I was a 1.
Okay.
I thought I was a strict perfectionist.
Isn't
that what we talked about?
No, we talked about that's your wing. So we'll get there. Hold up. See, this is one of the...
crap, I've been thinking the whole time.
Okay, so you're...
Of course I'm a considerate helper.
Yes, you're 2. Yep. Oh my gosh. Okay. Does that make you feel just better about your life? That was a little nicer than the...
Do you know why? Yep. Because that's one of the few that has positive language.
Yeah. Yep. So you're a 2. So if you dig into this report that you have, it's all about the 2. So you are a considerate helper, which that's to use this specific framework from the IEQ 9, but essentially the helper is kind of what the 2 is called, right? So, and you take on, we'll get to that in a sec. Okay, so this is what I love. This is a great example of one of my pros and cons of strengths is that Enneagram is very technical, specific language that's really hard to apply. And it's a little bit complex. So essentially you have your core type, which is you a 2, and I'm an 8. And when we're in a good place, naturally, we're going to take on the characteristics of another number a little bit. So we're going to take on, we're still our core type, we're always our core type, but then you take on the average to positive aspects of whatever number you move to on the wheel when you're in a good and healthy place. So for me, I move to a 2 when I'm in health. So when I don't have a lot of stress, when I have ample sleep, when I'm in a good mood, I naturally become more of a helper. So my challenger, my need to be against, which is my core type, my need to fight everything and be the devil's advocate, is going to take on the characteristics of using that in a really positive way to correct the injustices of the people I see around me.
Got it.
Okay, when I'm under stress, I move to a type 5, which is called the investigator or the observer, which means I'm going to withdraw. I'm going to become closed off emotionally. I'm going to become very logical and rational to the point of not really caring about other people's feelings and being very critical. So that would be under stress. I'm going to go to an average or an unhealthy form of that number. I'm going to take on those characteristics. I never really move there. I just kind of adopt the characteristics of each of those types when I'm either in a good place or a bad place, respectively. You're always still your core number, and that's how you find those lines of stress and security or integration, disintegration. Now, the type 1 that you were talking about, so each type has, on the wheel it has a type on either side of it. So the 2 would have the 1 and the 3 on either side of it, right? It goes in numerical order. Then the 8 has the 7 and the 9 on either side of it. And so each type is a very different personality. So and this is where some Enneagram teachers differ a little bit, but essentially there's this concept of a wing. So you take on, based on your unique form of your core, of your 2, my unique form of my 8, I'm going to take on probably a little bit of a personality from one of those 2 sides. Some teachers will say you can take on from both. Some people will say over your lifetime you'll shift back and forth to which one you lean on. And some people say, nope, you just have one wing. And that's your one wing. So I am an 8-wing 7. So a 7, as opposed to a 9 is a little more laid back. It's called the peacemaker, generally is the term used for the 9. They're a little bit of seeing all sides of a situation, being a little more appeasing, which definitely I feel like I could sometimes take on some of those characteristics, but they're pretty mellow, and they pretty much can be very agreeable, can get along with most people. So usually an 8, that's kind of this need to be against, with a 9 wing might seem a lot more subdued and mellow than someone who's like very strictly an 8, right? I have a little bit of a 7 wing, and a 7 wing is usually called the enthusiast, which is a little bit of an excitement for life, a passion for going out and doing fun things. And so like an example is, booking a trip to where I don't know where I'm going, right? So that's definitely someone with a 7 wing might do that, right? Or someone that is a 7 might do that, right? So there's, to summarize, you have your core value, you move to take on some characteristics of one number in stress, another number in security, but then you also can take on a little bit of the characteristics of those on either side of you. So when we were talking, I think you probably have a 1 wing as opposed to a 3 wing, and the 1 wing with a 2 looks a lot like a perfectionist. So an achiever is another term that's actually used for number 1. The 1 type, which is a lot of getting things right, accomplishing a lot. They're usually very successful people, but also a little bit perfectionist people, so have to like make sure everything looks good and everything is done well. Yes. So yeah, okay. Do those make sense?
Yes. This is a great realization that I'm a 2 because I thought I was a 1. So that's a good piece. That's a good okay. However, so it's really it's self-reflection that determines what your wing is, your dominant wing.
So there's a lot of writing about the characteristics of wings together, right? So you can really, just like in identifying your core type, if you dig into a lot of the literature around the Enneagram, you usually can be able to identify which wing you have. I would also say, like, I always thought I was a 9 wing because I'm usually kind of go with the flow, and I always think I wanted to claim that because kind of like strengths, there's a lot of archetypes of each of these numbers, and so I have quite a few 7 friends, and so I have in my mind what a 7 looks like, and I'm like, I'm not a let's go out and party, but then people are like, oh my gosh, Tess, you like booked a trip you didn't know where you were going to, and you know, and then they gave examples. So I think that's the cool part of, at least for me, a lot of my friends have this common language, just like strengths, which they do too, but my friends have seemed to grasp onto this a whole lot more, that they're able to then identify some of those characteristics within me.
So wings are more like theme blends in a lot of ways. In strengths language, it would be more like which you feel like is a blending.
Yeah. So it would be almost as if like your number 1 strength was your core strength, but then if we have the same core strength, it's going to look a little different because we have 4 other strengths around it, right? Okay. Yep. And so that actually leads me into kind of the third thing to understand about your core type and the Enneagram when you're typing is that there is what's called a sub or instinctual type. So there's, this is so hard to explain. I've never had to explain this before. So there's your core type, and you move somewhere when life is good and somewhere where life is bad. You take on those characteristics. You usually take on a little bit of characteristics from the numbers on either side of your number. But then there's also essentially 3 unique manifestations of each number. So it's almost then like if you go into the core number, right, instead of to the side or going out to stress and security, within each number, there's 3 variances of what that number can look like within people. Okay. So essentially a lot of Enneagram people say there aren't 9 types, there are 27 types, because each of the types has 3 different variations of it, which are the social, the one-to-one, or the self-preservation. And those are found here. And the one-to-one is also called the sexual manifestation is a term, but it's more like an intensity. And so how I would kind of compare and contrast those, which this is probably the part I know a little bit the least about, but the social is very much an extroversion, an interaction with lots of people, almost that kind of unique manifestation of that type.
Okay.
A one-to-one would be more a kind of one-to-one. It works really well with small groups, with individual relationships. And then a self-preservation is more of a natural tendency to be isolated and to only care about self. Or not only concentrate on self, only maybe be motivated by the
safety,
right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
So that might be what a little bit of those differences. So everybody has their core type, but then you also have a subtype that you identify with.
Okay. So on these results, this is not in order.
That's not in order. No.
Okay,
no. Sorry.
So I'm tremendously visual.
Yeah, you are.
And
so when you saw the one on top.
Yes. I didn't even look at the rest of the numbers.
One. Okay.
And then I'm seeing this and I'm thinking self-preservation's on top when actually I have to look further to see
Yep, so
social.
you are social. Yep. So,
okay, that makes sense.
Yep. So which is, a lot of large groups of people connecting well with people, especially as a 2, like identifying the needs of groups of people really easily, because the 2 a lot is about seeing the needs and trying to fill those gaps within people. And so that is your manifestation. So my specific type as an 8, my subtype is a one-to-one, which also makes probably a lot of sense. So my subtype is a lot about doing well with really small groups of people, being less comfortable with large groups of people. And I'm trying to think if I have any notes here to share kind of about my subtype. So kind of an intensity, a lot about quality over quantity. Seeking one-on-one connections. So we each kind of have a different manifestation. So that's, I think, kind of the cool thing is because not only is it about motivations, which are hard to identify, but externally looking, but you could see a couple people who might have the same core type, but they seem like very different people, right? And I think that's the same thing with strengths, right? Like you could have similar strengths within people, like you can share 4 out of 5 with somebody, but you're a very different person from each other because of the way that they blend together, or the way your life experiences have an effect on that, the way your values have an effect on that. So that's the cool thing, like you and my best friend are both a 2, right? And so, but you are very different people. I go to you for very different things, but you both are able to fundamentally identify what needs I might have in any given situation and try and meet those, albeit probably in a little bit of a different way.
Okay.
So that's like a way complex understanding of the structure. Some of the other things that people focus on a lot is that within each and why I think a lot of maybe religious groups have latched onto this is essentially each type has a kind of a virtue that's attached to it. So when it's in the best of all worlds, what does that type give to people? And then a type and then kind of a vice of each. So something where maybe is your unhealthiest sin pattern, right? Or something you get stuck in a lot that is unhealthy. Okay. And so
that makes all kinds of sense.
Yes. Right. So within each type, it makes a whole lot of sense. And then everyone has a basic fear and a basic desire. So there are all these things that are really core. There's all these philosophies about every single type has this massive childhood wound or uninterpreted childhood wound that they perceived growing up, and that has a lot of effect on their type. So there's like a lot more, like that was as much as a flyover as I think I could possibly give to it. I probably went into more detail than I needed to, but that's a lot of what I have come to learn about it. Within each type too, there's a bunch of what they call triads. So essentially there's actually like a lot of math involved in the Enneagram and in terms of how they are grouped together. So there are groups of, there's lots of different ones, but probably the one that's the most popular that people might have heard of is like the head, heart, and gut triad. So essentially 3 of the types, the 2, 3, and 4, I believe, are the heart triad. And 2, 3, and 4 are the heart triad, and essentially they sit most naturally in their hearts, right? They're more emotional people, they're much more relational people, they're very connected. 5, 6, and 7s are head people. And each of these correlate kind of to their basic kind of vice. So heart people deal a lot with pride. So you think about a considerate helper who might want to feel needed all the time, right? So natural tendency might be to feel prideful. The head people, so the 5, 6, and 7s that reside most naturally in their thinking center, their most kind of basic fault line is fear. So they struggle a lot with fear. And then the 8s, 9s, and 1s all sit in the gut. So they're action-oriented people. And so our basic kind of emotion, our default is actually anger, which is really funny and makes a lot of sense because a lot of people know I deal with road rage sometimes.
Right.
And I'm very impatient. So it's kind of interesting to see how they're grouped together and to see those connections. And then as you know, so you and I are connected because I go to a 2 when I'm in security, when I'm in a good place, and you actually come to an 8 when you're in a bad place. When you're not doing so well. You come to an 8, right? To this control, the need to this kind of anger inside. So I think of the example of like punching a wall. You mimic that all the time when you're under stress. You're like, I just got to punch a wall, which is a very visceral reaction out of anger, right? Which is where I naturally sit. And so you and I, as a 2 and an 8, are also connected to the 5. So we form a triad as well. And so everyone's kind of linked in different ways. Every number is linked kind of in different ways, but it's just, I think, super complex. So anyway, I do want to migrate us because there's still, I feel like, a lot more involved with an overarching understanding of the Enneagram, but I want to loop us. I don't think I'm going to cover that.
Okay, because I'm curious about
that. Okay. So you had asked, so Allie asked in her report about the centers of expression, which I think are a lot of those triads that I talked about. They're the feeling, the thinking, and the action center, right? Which is your heart, your head, or your gut.
Right.
And so each type has a place where they sit on that wheel. So you naturally sit in the feeling center. So you're most connected to your feelings.
Right.
You're most naturally in touch with your feelings. I sit in the action center. So I'm most naturally connected to actions or to my body. So when you think a lot about like me running or exercising, like most people feel good after it, but I feel like my whole day can be turned around if I get up and moving. So you each type has its natural one of those that connects to the head, the heart, or the gut, but then it also has one that it connects to the least. So the part that needs to be tapped into the most to bring a further sense of wholeness, right?
So I saw action center as decision making.
Sure, absolutely.
And so when I saw high feeling, yes. Thinking, yes, but then decision making is difficult for me. But also I know that movement is what heals me. Yeah. So, I'm very intellectual with my decision making. I get stuck sometimes. My trap is emotion, feeling, but then movement heals
you, which is where you're most disconnected, right? Yes. So tapping into the disconnected center helps to bring more wholeness to you, right? And so for me, I am most connected to my action. So I'm really good at making decisions, like let's go, right? I am somewhat connected to my thinking center. Yes. So especially with a 7 wing, because the 7 is in the thinking center, but I'm least connected to my feeling center. So I'm least in touch with my emotions. And emotions are what heals me. So when I pause to think about what I'm feeling, when I carve out an evening to let one of my friends sit and listen and help me verbally process and therefore emotionally process what I'm feeling, like that brings healing to me and to my relationships.
Right.
But it's not where I'm most in touch, right? I literally, for the longest time when I was really trying to work on this, when I was like seeing a counselor a while ago, just dealing with like some childhood wounds, she gave me a feeling wheel because she's like, you can't even identify or put words to what you're feeling. Mm-hmm. So here is a wheel, like, which is very, well-known kind of in psychology, but I had to pull it out. I had it I tacked up on my fridge forever just to say, because if you were to ask me at any given moment, I would just say, oh yeah, I'm kind of angry or frustrated. And those are the only two things I could ever be in touch with because that's my default, right? My default is anger as innate. So the connecting and reaching out to whichever center or think head, heart, or gut, whichever one you're least connected to as your type, that actually brings kind of wholeness to and healing to the self. So that's a good one. I like that triad, and people talk about that a lot, I think, out of any of the triads within the Enneagram. Okay. So I do want to bring us, because you and I are both very strengths-based, so I wanted to do a little bit of compare-contrast with strengths in the Enneagram. So I would say, so I have a little bit of a list that I wrote out, and I think I want to start with the fact that strengths is a statistically valid measurement of people, right? And the Enneagram is not. It really isn't. As much as it's been helpful for me, as much as it's interesting to talk about, it's not statistically valid. It's not been measured. It's not been proven the way that strengths has. Like, you can read the 100-page meta-analysis of strengths and personality to see its validity. And that kind of leads me to the second point I wanted to talk about, which is the difference of the theory of each of these, right? So how each was constructed, right? We know that strengths, and we've talked about this with a lot of people, came from Don Clifton going and observing and interviewing people. So it is an inductive approach, what we would call an inductive approach to research. So it's starting with your data first. So gathering as much information as you can about people, about their behavior, about what they do, about the decisions they make, like as much information as possible. And then the themes were drawn out based on the patterns within human behavior. So it started with the person. Enneagram, as much as it's been interesting, I wouldn't necessarily say I love it. It seems a bit extreme for being a strengths coach, but it's been very interesting to dive into. But it is a deductive research approach, which is very different than an inductive approach. So it is a lot like Myers-Briggs, like colors, like a lot of the other common personality types, like DISC, where essentially it starts with a theory, a construct of what people are like, and then retroactively tries to fit people into these preconceived categories, which is hard, which is, I think is a very hard way, and why I find strengths so refreshing, because it started with people and research first. Right. So there are some, like, I guess, positive benefits too to the difference between these. Strengths is a lot about your behavior. It's about what you do. So you can strength spot somebody easily, right? Fairly easily, right? You do that. You come in and you smile. I can spot your positivity, right? I can't necessarily spot your type. You and I might both walk into the office because we're smiling. You might do it because you helped an old lady across the street. I might do it because I wrote into my congresswoman this morning, right? So, like, we have very different motivations for why we might be smiling, but our output, our behavior might be the same, right? And so,
such a good example.
So to contrast, the Enneagram is about your motivation. It's about your why. Why do you do things, right? Which, held in tandem, could be very beneficial together, right? To be able to understand both. But my kind of next point is that the Enneagram is very, very personal. It digs into a lot of very vulnerable and actually kind of nasty things about who we are as human beings. So when I talked at the beginning about never wanting to label or type somebody, or never asking them to do that, like, although I might be curious and it might be helpful in relationship to know someone's motivation, I never want to put that on somebody, because it's a judgmental approach, really, in the end. So, if I think about, something like the core wounds, or the childhood wounds of a type, for example, right? So like my childhood wound, the need to be against, there's a self-survival instinct. I'm trying to think where the, let me see. There is, I thought it was in this book, sorry, I thought I was going to have it prepared, but okay, so the childhood wound is an acceleration of maturity as a result of a conflict or harsh environment where they felt the need to be strong in order to survive. And I think about what I learned a lot from my mom, who is awesome, and she is so great now, but growing up was pretty critical, very harsh. And so therefore I needed to survive in an environment where I didn't feel emotionally nurtured, right? And so I have this childhood wound, right? So I'm not going to go up to somebody and say, were you neglected as a child, right? Because you might be an age, right? Or did you need to have self-survival instincts because you grew up in a cold environment, right? So it's very personal, and
the questions are deeply personal.
The questions are deeply personal if you were to take the assessment, or if you were to walk through a typing session with somebody, right? They're going to ask some of these things. And to get to your true core number, you have to be honest about those things.
Right.
Which there's like a level of you have to come to it with vulnerability, or else it will not make sense and it will not be beneficial. It won't be a tool.
You have to come to it with authenticity as well.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
Not just vulnerability, but some self-awareness.
Yes.
Because I think if I would have taken this 10 years ago, I wouldn't be at a place where I could even own.
Yeah.
So the last statement, I think the last statement question that's on the assessment says, I have answered these honestly. And you can say, I think, what are the options? Very true, absolutely true, somewhat true. I don't remember how it goes. But I thought, well, who wouldn't? Well, what's the point of that?
A lot of people who wouldn't, probably.
But when, in some of the statements, were kind of hard to answer.
Yeah.
And I had to step back and say, okay, you're going to have to be totally honest here.
And I think it's interesting that was the last question on that one. And again, it might not be the best path for everybody if you're going to learn your type, but because there are some types that have self-delusion involved in them, or a lack of awareness of the self. So people talk about the 9 being the peacemaker, adopts the personality of anybody they're around. So a 9 is the hardest for them to identify in themselves. And so therefore something like that as a question at the end, a 9 is not going to know if they answered them truthfully. They're probably going to be lower. So that might be an indication of that specific type coming out, right? I remember being like, because I did take this for curiosity's sake. I knew my type at this point, but I was like, I wonder if it'll type me right. And so I was like, absolutely, right? Because I'm just like, yep, I get it, I know it. But someone who might not, or who might be in and the 3 is kind of like that. The 3 is a little bit of, it's called the performer, is the term that I hear most associated with it. So you're really good at figuring out who you need to be in any given situation, or what you need to portray. And so that might be a little bit of a self-deception as well. So it's probably getting at some of that. But yeah.
I think you can be that and know it.
Yeah. Yep. And you can be that and totally be unaware as well.
Right.
But those could look very similar, the 3 and the 9. But again, it comes from a different motivation. The motivation of the 3, a lot of 3s are concerned about status, about the connections they need to make in order to advance, right? About their perception, how other people view them. Whereas the 9 is about, I need to be whoever I need to be in this context for the sake of retaining peace and harmony. And so they come from different motivations, but can look different on the outside. So, but that's why I find this somewhat hard to apply in a large scale, and why I would never recommend it for like an organization or, massive like groups of people, systemic implementation like you would do with strengths, and why strengths is so beneficial in that way, because it is so personal, right? Like this is valid for like a counselor maybe to work with.
If you're working with a therapist.
If you're working with a therapist, right? If you're working with a counselor, or if you're working with close friends who know you, who you're honest with, and who also are interested in this framework, right? But it's never something I would ask somebody to ask to do it, somebody to do it, unless we're in the context of something where it would be really beneficial to them. So one of the other things I want to talk about a little bit, and you alluded to, is that strengths, you can start out anywhere and start with strengths, right?
Right.
To do the Enneagram, you have to start at deep work. Like, it requires you to start there. So you have to have a level of self-awareness already in place. And that's why I think it can somewhat be beneficial to use these hand in hand in a very exclusive
deep level,
right? At a deep level. Like, if you're working with a counselor, if you're having, marital issues, if you're having relational issues, if you are just like, gosh, I love personal development like me and I want to go even deeper.
But
right?
I'm working with a coach.
But I'm working with,
right.
they don't really have any, I don't know if I think they have Enneagram coaches, but at the same time, there are tons of resources out there that, I don't know. So that's a whole different thing. But
I mean, so I wouldn't have wanted to do this without your assistance.
Me. Yeah.
Because I'm still completely confused.
Yeah, right? Okay, so that's our next point. Enneagram is all technical language. It's like as much as we joke about like the technical language from Gallup of balconies and basements and raw versus mature, like there's simple concepts to grasp.
Yes.
The Enneagram is very, very complex, and you do need really someone to teach it to you, or you need to really invest in it, right? Like, I have been studying it for over a year and still feel a little inadequate to be doing this episode right now, because I still don't feel like I can fully explain subtypes or fully understand. I can't, if you pick any number, I couldn't tell you where it goes without looking at the diagram of integration and disintegration, right? Like, I know my type, I know my friends' types, but yeah, so I think that's hard is it's very technical language, and strengths is common language. It's very easy to understand strengths, although you can go deeper into any theme, but it's still a bit easier to grasp. I would say, though, because I'm an 8 and want to play the devil's advocate, that there's also a benefit to having, or a con to strengths being super common language. We know that sometimes there are misperceptions of strengths based on the fact that they are common language.
Right.
Understanding and trying to explain what the strategic themes look like, the strategic theme looks like, versus someone who might think critically but not have strategic in their top 5.
Right.
Like, that's sometimes hard because strategic is a buzzword. Positivity is like that too, right? There's misperceptions based on the fact that all the themes are fairly common language.
And I do think sometimes the common language makes it, unfortunately, easier to put people in boxes and labels.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. Yep. It's not theoretically is reductive, but because of the common language,
yes.
It can be reductive.
Yes.
Whereas I feel like the Enneagram is kind of just a reductive mechanism, in a lot of the fundamental ways, until you dive into subtypes and wings and integration and disintegration. So I think that they're, overall, and I've done this because lots of people have asked me about these two. I think that strengths is the only thing you ever need for personal development, because you can keep diving deeper and deeper and deeper into your themes. I don't think there's any reason you need necessarily anything supplementary. As I mentioned before, strengths can be complementary to your Enneagram type. So it's been interesting to learn about how my strengths play out based on my number, right? It looks different. There are definitely themes that automatically contribute to my 8-ness, and there are themes that take my 7-ness on as my wing, but it's interesting because if you were to look at my strengths, you probably would have mistyped me as my original mistype, which I claimed for a while, as the 5, which is the observer, the investigator also called, but when I dug into it, it wasn't truly my core motivation that I could claim. So I went through the retyping process and have fully claimed the 8. But you could look at strengths and try and type somebody. But I think the hard part about that is that they really are trying to get at 2 different things in the end. And I think that's what I keep coming back to. Like, the Enneagram's about your motivations internally, and your strengths a lot is about your talent behavior. So reoccurring behaviors, your talents that become talent themes that you invest in to equal strengths. So I think that that's, I guess, a way to compare and contrast. Like I said, they can be used in tandem. They can be very complementary, but they also can get in the way a lot in terms of how they conflict with one another. So I will point out some of the things maybe in which your strengths and your Enneagram type complement each other. So you as a type 2, Allie, the helper.
Do you want to read the full 9? Hey, and why 9?
Why 9? I have no idea. Again.
Okay. I mean, that'd really be like someone asking us why 34, and I don't know that I can answer that question either.
And so just what it came out to be, right? So the full 9. So I'm not going to use these names. because I don't know that these are the ones that I claimed, the ones from this report. So I'll probably use the ones from this book, actually.
Should we pause?
Should we pause?
Let's pause.
Because you want to keep going?
Yeah, we're going to keep going. So let's do a pause.
Okay. Alrighty.
So this was a intro, and now you're going to talk about what they mean.
What they mean? Sure. Go into each of them.
And I feel like you can use you or me or whoever you want, but if you give real life examples to someone that they know, they will be able to resonate with it. Okay. So as I'm reading this now, I'm thinking, okay, yes.
Yeah, it makes a whole lot of sense.
And over-focusing on others leads you to not be consistently tuned into your own needs.
Okay, we're going to get into that. All right, hold up. Okay, so we're going to pause. Am I going to wrap up this episode and then we're going to do a second episode?
Don't you think?
Okay. I think that's good. All right.
Do you need anything?
So I am... Yeah, we're still recording.
Oh.
I love this. I'm like, you just go to open the door and I haven't stopped yet. So because we're summing up the episode, I'm going to do our conclusion. But thank you everyone for tuning into episode 47 of Genn and Millie. I love this. You can tell we try to prepare, but it doesn't always work. If you enjoyed today's episode, feel free to share it. We're not going to really have any takeaways because we, again, don't want to put this on anybody to do. I think it just came from some questions. We're always open to covering whatever topics people want to hear about. And this was one that had been asked of us. And one that I happen to know a little bit more about enough to feel like I can share it. So if you do have any reactions or thoughts based on this episode, feel free to let us know. We'd love to hear more from you. You can follow us on Instagram at Genn and Millie. That's at GENNANDMILLIE. And then look forward to the next episode.
Closing.
Yes, part one.
The next episode is right now.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So those of you who want to hang with us, like, just dial into the next one.
Yeah.
So I don't want them to think that cut and there's nothing.
There's nothing.
But
we're going to cut. It's coming. It'll be there. But we do want to divide it because we already are approaching an hour. So I'm going to stop recording now, but we'll talk to you all soon.